Hey guys, so I set up to do the ABL heat treat run. I picked up some dry ice this morning, so after this is going through the first temper cycle, I can do the cryo on it. The oven is set up to run a 3-part program. The first part is it's going to ramp to 1100 with the gas off, because until 1100 degrees or 1200 degrees, there's no reason to run the gas. I'm not going to get any decarb. At that point, it'll turn the gas on, and then it'll ramp up to 1550. It holds at 1550 for 10 minutes and turns the gas on at that point. So I'll purge, I'll come over and make sure I have it cranked up and purge the whole oven out at like probably about 20 bars or 15 bars. And then I'll drop it back down to about 5. It doesn't take much volume to clear out the inside of this because this gas expands quite a bit. At that point, it'll ramp up, after the 10-minute soak, it'll ramp up to 1950, and it'll hold for 30 minutes. Actually, I think I have it set to hold for 45 minutes. After 30 minutes, though, I'm going to take it out and quench and let it cool, and then I'll put it in the temper oven. So we'll come back when it's ready to quench. So this just kicked over to 1,000 degrees, and the gas turned on. You can see I'm running it with about 10 bars. I'm going to purge it real quick, and then back this down right about 5. I really don't need a lot of gas to keep this purged. Now that it's up to temperature, I can also throw a piece of charcoal in front to scavenge oxygen off as well, which I'll do in a second. So this has been at temperature for about 15-20 minutes. I let it equalize before I counted that, so it's ready to go into the quench. I'm going to quench in oil and then let it cool down until I can touch it before I do the snap temper. So first thing I'm going to do is just really quickly reach in, grab one of these guys, close that, and into the oil. That will probably work like a bastard. Yeah, a little bit. So, just like carbon steel, I can still straighten a little bit in here if I need to. That's pretty good. Let that one cool. Actually, we'll cool that down a little more. And then I'm going to repeat the same thing with the next one. Stay quite a bit straighter. There we go. Okay, so I figured I'd take a minute and explain why cryo is necessary for stainless. So in most carbon steels, you end up with a little bit of what's called retained austenite every time you quench. And that is the high temperature structure of steel that exists at room temperature, but it doesn't really want to exist at room temperature, so through either tempering, dislocation, it can kind of convert back to martensite. In carbon steel, it's usually not too much of an issue unless you really have a very high carbon content and screwed the heat treat up. As long as you're careful about it, you don't need to cryo carbon steels. Stainless steels are different. Because of the amount of alloy in them and the chemistry involved, what ends up happening is it changes the TTT charts. First thing is you end up with this secondary bump, which is what allows for air hardening. Basically, your perlite nose gets doubled, so you get a second chance to turn to martensite. The other thing is that you end up with the first part, this martensite start, still ends up somewhere in here, 600-800 degrees. But the martensite finish point ends up down below room temperature, usually significantly below room temperature. The 2 points we really worry about is if it's below 100 or below 200. 100, if it's 100 degrees below zero, you can use dry ice or a little less, and that'll get you to like 110. If it is below that point, as it is with like ATS 34, SV30, some of the others, not SV30, S3V, those steels need nitrogen, and nitrogen gets down below 250 degrees below zero, and that will convert that austenite. If you do not use cryo, what ends up happening is you get a large amount of retained austenite. Austenite is not stable at room temperature, and then what will happen with that austenite is it'll start to convert to martensite. It'll convert through dislocation, in other words, being bent or smacked or tapped. Any impact to the knife will convert little pockets of austenite to martensite. The problem is then it's martensite, but it's untempered martensite. So we need to find a way to force that conversion so that we can temper the martensite. Otherwise, you end up with very large brittle areas within the knife, and it'll get worse over time as those areas dislocate and just age out into martensite. The reason for that is in room temperature, steel does not want to be austenite. Austenite is something that it can only really exist at high temperatures. However, other metals in the alloy exist in austenite state. Nickel is a good example of this. Nickel, if there's too much nickel in the steel, it will always be austenite. It can never not be austenite. And that's how you get austenitic stainlesses or non-hardenable stainless steels. Things like 304, 316. Those have so much nickel, they have forced that structure over so it's stable at room temperature. Hardenable steels don't have that issue, but they won't be able to turn over to martensite without this added step. What that means for us knife makers is that we need to bring the hardness down as fast as possible. I find if you quench in oil or plate quench with air and force that to the very fastest you can get this quench and try to cross this line instead of this line, then you end up with much less retained austenite. The next thing that'll do it, you want to snap temper so you have a little bit of temper in the steel. That'll convert some, but it also takes some of that stress away. And when you put it in the dry ice slurry or the nitrogen, it's under a great deal of stress from that austenite all converting. It's as if it's hardening in a minute. So that hour soak in there, you want to be tempered when you go in, otherwise you risk a lot more cracking. But after that, you're pretty much all converted to martensite. So then we want to temper at the temperature we're going for hardness. So in this case, I'm going to go about 400 degrees, which should give me about 60 Rockwell, 61. And I'll do that 3 times. And the reason I do that 3 times is every time I'm tempering, I'm getting a little bit more retained austenite. It's just a safe bet to do 3. After 3, anything that's not converted isn't going to be converted. It's probably stable at that point. It's probably nickel based. So that is the reason we need to cryo on stainlesses. And I can hear my oven is ready to go. So we're going to set up to do the quench. All right, so these were in for about 20 minutes, and they warped a little bit, which is normal. This one, especially in the tank's got quite a bit of warpage. I will deal with that after. I'm going to grind the sides because the decarb from forging can actually cause it to warp just that. So before I do any adjustment for straightening, I'm going to make sure I do that. The next step is to cryo. These are down at room temperature. I can touch them. I have dry ice slurry with alcohol in here. You're not going to be able to see it because it's covered in very fun foam. I'm just going to make sure these are submerged under the ice. That's the level there. And now I'll leave them in there for at least an hour. Hour and 20 is fine too. That'll give me the rest of the conversion to martensite, and then I can go into the temper oven again at my desired temper for hardness. In this case, it's probably going to be about 60. So I'll shoot for about 400 degree temper. They've been in here for about an hour. I'm going to pull them out. I've already kind of rooted on in here a little bit. This is frozen alcohol on the surface. There we go. Next into the oven at 400 for 2 hours.